Imagine you're a man in 1934. You're at Ararat and the Overland comes into view, headed by two massive machines, equipped with 4 small wheels, 6 large drivers, large elephant-like smoke deflectors, a fat boiler, and they were clearly built for speed. This is the A2 class, one of the most successful passenger locomotives to ever run on Victorian metals. Early life. The A2s were built at a time when Victorian railways were changing. No longer were they going to import engines from other countries. If they needed engines, they were going to build them perfectly to suit the Victorian need at their very own Newport workshops. In the early 1900s, the Victorian railways needed a fast, high-powered mainline passenger engine. While the DD classes had been built to fill the same role a few years prior, in 1902, they simply weren't going to cut it on mainline trains. So the engineers at Newport took the DD plans and fattened them up, which created the first A2. The prototype, A2572, rolled out of Newport on the 2nd of December 1907, painted in the VR flashy Canadian red, which is what all the A2s would wear until 1921, when black became the standard VR livery. This A2 was an overall success, and a further 125 A2s were built between 1908 and 1915, with the second, A2574, rolling out of Newport on the 28th of October 1908. These first 125 featured the relatively simple Stephenson's valve gear. However, the second batch of A2 locomotives were built with Walschaerts valve gear. I'll go through the differences later. However, this variety proved to be far more successful, although no Stephensons were ever converted. A total of 185 A2s were built in 10 batches. However, an extra 10 were meant to be constructed as part of the last batch of 40. They were cancelled. There isn't a concrete reason why they were cancelled, but my guess is that most of the C-Class heavy goods engines were built from 1921 to 22, which could handle a lot more goods work than the A2s. The cancelled 10 would have been numbered 1083 to 1092, and yes, the Victorian Railways went into the quad digits in the early 1900s. While I said all A2s were built at Newport, I lied. The first 20 of batch 10 were, but the next 10 were built at Ballarat, and the final 10 were built at Bendigo. It's not clear where the cancelled 10 were going to be built, but my guess is that they would have been built with the 10 at Bendigo. Working life. For the next 45 years, the A2s were the premier express passenger engine on all main lines, with the exception of the Northeast Line after 1928. These engines could be seen pretty much anywhere, and even sometimes going interstate. However, the A2s were most famous for hauling the Geelong Flyer, which would fly, pun intended, down the Geelong main line at the A2's top permissible speed of 115 km per hour, running express from Melbourne to Geelong each direction once per day, at an impressive 63 minutes from Flinders Street. Later cut down to 55, departing from Spencer Street instead. However, stopping all station trains would still take about 90 minutes. The A2s were also extremely versatile. While also being used on mainline passenger services, they were also used on fast goods trains, especially later in life. Although they were mostly replaced on fast goods trains with the introduction of the C-Class and later X-Classes. A2s would also double head on the Overland, which was a problem they were trying to fix with the introduction of Heavy Harry. However, that didn't go anywhere. There was also a plan to build more S-Class streamliners for the Western Line, but with the railway workshops clogged up making war supplies, that also went nowhere. So the Overland was repeatedly double-headed by A2s until the introduction of the S-Class streamliners in 1956. A2s have also been given the honour of transporting royalty, with A2s hauling the royal train in 1920 when the Prince of Wales came to visit, not sure which one, and in 1927 when the Duke and Duchess of York came to visit. A2993 hauled the train to Bendigo, A2976 and A2948 double head to Geelong, and finally A2993 and another A2 to Adelaide. On the topic of special trains, A2995 and 996 also had the distinction of hauling the last broad gauge Spirit of Progress in 1962, which the pair would have also teamed up a year prior to haul an ARHS special to Balan. In 1933, a pair of A2s also set a haulage record for the Victorian Railways, a record of 75 wagons or 1,789.75 tonnes of wheat, all of which was loaded out on the Oaklands line. The A2s lugged the wheat from Benalla to Seymour. At Seymour, the front portion of the train was detached to lower the weight to about 1,239 tonnes, and a C-Class hauled the train to the destination of Williamstown. being assisted by an X-Class until Wallen. At some point, the crews that operated the A2s knew so much about them, they made a note of which engines were more well-behaved, temperamental, and poor performers, with 832 on flat terrain only, 532, 940, 942, 947, 955, 966, 970 to 979, 993, and 994 being apparently good performers. Accidents. Being a frequent sight on the Victorian railways, it's no surprise that A2s have been in some serious accidents, and here are two of the worst. Wodonga, 1943. On the 8th of May 1943, A2 863, built in 1913 with Stephenson's valve gear, was travelling at speed as it was approaching the Tallangatta Road level crossing in Wodonga, what is now Thomas Mitchell Drive, with its destination marked for Bandiana. As the train approached, an army bus carrying 35 soldiers was attempting to get to Albury, was also approaching the level crossing, originating from Benegala. Witnesses and bystanders attempted to grab the attention of the driver before it crossed the level crossing. However, these efforts were all in vain. At 6:30 PM, as the army bus crossed the level crossing, there was no stopping the train, and it smashed into the center of the bus, killing 25 of the passengers, including the driver. This would become the worst level crossing accident in the whole of Australia. Today, there is a plaque commemorating the lives that were lost. Surveston, 1951. On the 7th of September 1951, at 2:53 AM, A2 977, built in 1922 with Walshart's valve gear, and A2 958, built in 1920 with Walshart's valve gear, were as usual double-heading the westbound overland, with 977 leading. It was arriving into Surveston station as the late-running eastbound overland was departing, led by A2 953 and A2 946. Now, if everything had gone as scheduled, these trains should have passed each other at Daipur. However, if things had gone as planned, I wouldn't be telling you about this accident. Usually, if late running was to occur, the westbound overland would stop at the home signal and the eastbound would shunt out of the way. However, for whatever reason, the signals were set to proceed for the westbound and the eastbound was halted at the platform. And at 2:53 AM, the westbound overland smashed into the stationary eastbound overland at around 50 km per hour. All four engines were severely damaged, and what made the accident worse was one of the A2's oil tanks exploded on impact, spreading burning oil everywhere, with the blaze lasting about 3 hours. Miraculously, none of the over 600 passengers was seriously injured, although the same can't be said for the engine crew, with the only death in the accident being 22-year-old Keith Hosking, acting as A2 977's fireman. He was trapped in the cab and passed away at the controls. I won't go into details, but his body couldn't be retrieved until the fire ceased. 3 of the 4 engines were cut up on the spot, with A2 946 being the only one to return to service. Specifications. The A2s were a 460 tender engine, known in the white notation as a 10-wheeler. They were built for Irish broad gauge, and weren't built for any other gauges, nor could they be converted to any other gauges. They were fitted with electric headlights and automatic staff exchanges from 1926. They had 75-inch/1.85 diameter driving wheels, and they were 19.3 meters long. They weighed 123.3 tons, and had attractive effort and 22.4 kilonewtons at 85% boiler pressure. They had a 2.7 square meter grey area and a 185 psi boiler. After oil firing conversion, I'll get to that later, their tenders could hold 6,800 litres of oil and 21,000 litres of water. Design and modification. Now, being engines with such a long service life, it's no wonder that there were many modifications done to them. Being the fact that it's later now, here are the differences between Stephenson's and Walshart's A2s. The main difference being the drastically different front ends. The front ends were modified to be a full curve, mainly to allow space for the larger cylinder block, which also included a larger cylinder diameter, Walshart's valve gear, and some with superheaters. These Walshart engines were overall an improvement. Most A2s were built with saturated steam boilers, which are boilers which heat up water to its boiling point. These A2s were progressively modified to feature superheated boilers. However, they couldn't all be converted at the same time. So for a short time, some A2s with saturated boilers were reclassified as A1s, and reclassified A2s once the superheater conversion was complete. Many engines during this time had their numbers constantly changed, as an attempt to keep the classes in separate number blocks. The last A1 to be converted was A1 808, which was renumbered to A2 816, and it re-entered service on the 11th of May 1949. The fleet had a rather heavy axle load, being 17.8 tons, so when the first of these engines were introduced, they were delegated to main lines, being too heavy for any other lines. However, over time, they were permitted to travel on more routes. However, even with them being mainline only, they were also too fat, and their outside cylinders would occasionally scrape against platform edges, usually at speed. Probably the reason it took nearly 11 months to get the next A2 out. A modification that primarily goods-working A2s received was slight adjustments to their axle boxes and the swapping of some moving parts to accommodate the lower speeds of goods work, done to squeeze more work out of them before the next overhaul. Just like most other steam locomotives at the time, from 1923 to 1924, A2 800 was modified to burn pulverized brown coal. I might talk about this topic in another video, however for the A2 and most other engines, the conversion didn't show the results that VR hoped for, and it was converted back soon after. On the topic of experiments applied to a lot of engines, the modified front end improvements, which were eventually applied to all C, N, K, and S classes. In 1933, C5 was the first engine to gain these improvements. The design was based off of drawings of a self-cleaning firebox made by the Association of American Railroads to improve steaming quality. The data on the C was very promising, so Walshart's valve gear A2998 was selected for a series of further tests aimed at further front-end improvements. The experiment was conducted under the VR rolling stock branch engineer, Edgar Brownhill. I won't really go into every little detail which was modified, but the main modification was a different rosebud type firebox grate with slimmer air holes, which improved fire stabilities under heavy load, giving better firing capabilities. Overall, the experiment was a rousing success, with an increase of drawbar horsepower of about 40%, from 880 horsepower at 42 km per hour to 1,230 horsepower at 51 km per hour. The adjustments were applied to all A2s at a cost of around £140 each engine at the time. The entire fleet was gradually modified, with the non-modified A2s being called basher engines to distinguish them better. With the new modifications, time savings were recorded of up to 20 minutes on the Melbourne to Bendigo Express, being reduced from 162 minutes to 145 minutes, and an unbelievable couple hours being able to be cut from the Melbourne to Adelaide overland. However, the modified front end wasn't an entire improvement. With the revisions to the smoke box, steam escaping the cylinders wasn't able to escape out of the funnel as well as it used to, so smoke deflectors were fitted so visibility was still able to be maintained. In my opinion, the Walshart's A2s look much better with smoke deflectors, however the Stephenson's A2s are another story. In 1935, A2 973 was fitted with these massive pipes all around its boiler. Well, this was an experimental ACFI feed water heater. A feed water heater basically takes the water from the tender and using the still relatively hot steam blown out of the cylinders, heats up the feed water heater, which heats up the water from the tender and injects it into the boiler. In theory, this would reduce stress on the boiler and allow steam to be produced faster. Normally, the water in the tender, which is ejected, would be at 90 degrees and hit a 200-degree boiler, and to its credit it did just that, reducing stress on the boiler. However, it wasn't a substantial improvement to efficiency, and was far more costly to maintain, so it was removed 12 years later in 1947. After the Second World War, with oil cheaper than ever, most Walshart's A2s were converted to oil firing, and all A2s were converted in 1946, with the exceptions of 998, 970, 975, and 956, because they wanted to be so quirky. Demise. With the arrival of the Second World War in 1939, everything on the Victorian railways was pretty much used until they broke, with little maintenance being done, with the exception of 20 A2s who received new boilers during the war years built by Clyde Engineering in Granville. But besides that, most of the A2s were no different, and with most of the class already being 25 once the war started, the A2s were pretty worn by the time the war ended. However, due to them being the primary express engine, they were still pushed, mostly without maintenance, even after the war. With the backlog of repairs and limited money, construction of new replacements were not happening anytime soon. And it wasn't until March 1946 when the first A2, A2878 was withdrawn. About 5 A2s also did receive new box spoke wheels during this time, as the standard spoke wheels were suffering cracks and fatigue after 4 decades of constant use. Although these engines tended to ride rougher compared to the rest of the fleet. With the introduction of the R-classes in 1951, the A2s could finally be given a rest after 45 years of hard work. In 1953, 53 A2s went to the scrappers, followed by 36 in 1934. However, the remaining, mostly Walschaerts engines, were retained on secondary branch line and goods work, although this wasn't the case for 6 Stephenson's engines, these being 826, 840, 876, 903, 834, and 923, who had their smoke deflectors removed and shunter steps added to be used as yard pilots, with all of them being scrapped at various times throughout the late 50s and early 60s. The last regularly scheduled service hauled by an A2 on the main line was a passenger service from Flinders Street to Leongatha and back, although I'm not sure which one. The last A2 in service was A2986, which has a very interesting history after withdrawal. She was withdrawn on the 2nd of December, exactly 56 years after the first A2 hit the rails. Her last run was an ARHS special to Hillsville and back. Preservation. Out of the 185 engines built, a depressing 5 are preserved. This is most likely due to the fact that most of them were cut up during the 50s, and railway preservation didn't really take off until the 60s. Nevertheless, there are still 5 of these beauties preserved, 4 static and 1 operational. A2986. A2986 was built at Newport Workshops and entered service in 1915. As a member of the 9th batch of Walschaert engines. It was superheated in 1917 and was oil-fired in August 1946. Just like most of the A2s, it mostly worked on main lines and secondary branch lines. In the last few years of its working career, it could be seen working the Ballarat and Geelong lines, hauling goods and carrying passengers. In 1962, it also acted as the West Footscray shunter for a month. And of course, as it was the last A2 in service, it was obviously used on a plethora of heritage trains. A2986 was the last A2 in service, being withdrawn in 1963 and written off in 1964. It was then stored at Newport for a few years and was luckily snapped up for static preservation by the Warragul and District Railway Club and Rotary Club. It was moved to Warragul in July 1971 and plinthed in Warragul Park, where it would remain static at Warragul until 1986. When Steam Rail Victoria selected it to be restored to operational condition, doing a loco swap with J550, which might also be returning to traffic. It was towed back to Newport Workshops on a goods train on the 4th of April, with big bold Steam Rail letters on the tender. It would stay at Newport being slowly worked on for the next 30 years, with restoration work progressing gradually, with it being restored to coal firing rather than oil firing. In 2014 a milestone was reached, where on the 24th of February, a fire was lit in its firebox for the first time in a little over 50 years. After another year and a half of reassembling the puzzle pieces, on the 15th of May 2015, the engine was fired up and moved under its own power for the first time in preservation. On the 25th of October 1915, A2986 undertook its first of many mainline tests on the South Kingsville freight line, wearing its grey undercoat and accompanied by T395. It received a new coat of lacquer sometime between the tests and the 2016 Newport Workshops Open Day. In July 2016, A2986 led a members-only test train to Seymour, and testing continued until May 17, 2017, when A2986 was officially relaunched on a very fitting run to Warragul and Traralgon, where at Warragul it was christened with the name Spirit of Warragul. Since then, it has been used on a myriad of heritage trains, just like the 60s. Thanks for watching, guys. While the A2s aren't my all-time favourite, they are very nice engines. By now, you probably are wondering why they're called A2s, and not, say, A-classes. Well, that's because there was an A-class, which is this thing, built in 1884, but then there was another A-class, built in 1889. So the 1884 A-classes were renamed Old A-classes, and the 1889 A-classes were renamed New classes. At the turn of the century, in 1900, another 440 A-class was built, this time being classified AA classes. Then came along the A1s and A2s, I talked about in this video. But then we also have the Diesel A classes, which are rebuilt B classes ordered by V-Line. And don't even get me started on the Tram A1 and A2 classes. If you have any suggestions or video ideas, leave them in the comments below. If not, like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.